Hello, who are you?
Hi, my name's Sam Illingworth, or I guess Dr. Sam Illingworth if we're being incredibly formal, and I'm a senior lecturer in science communication at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. And what that means, and I suppose what my research is around, is in developing dialogue between a variety of different audiences, and in particular trying to give voice to audiences that have traditionally been underserved and underheard. So my scientific background is I have a MPhys in physics with space science and technology, a PhD in atmospheric physics. But whilst I spent a lot of time looking at using satellites and drones and aircrafts to make measurements of greenhouse gases and how they influence climate change, what my research and my work really is involved with now is in trying to give voice to non-scientists in the development of original research and in research governance and research direction. And in particular, really trying to make sure that scientists and people that work with scientists don't think that they're the only experts, as many, in fact, almost all non-scientists are also experts in their various fields. And it's how we can work with those various publics, tap into their expertise, tap into their knowledge, tap into their lived experiences to really help to drive forward innovation and also to reflect as scientists as to why we're doing certain research and what we're doing and how we might do it as well.
You bring other disciplines into your area of specialisation, and you do it so incredibly successfully, sparking emotion, sparking interest, curiosity. Can you talk us through how you do that and what those disciplines are?
Of course, well, that's very kind of you. So I guess generally I have an arts-based approach to engendering dialogue between different audiences, and in particular the use of poetry and the use of games. And the reason for this is that when we bring together scientists and non-scientists, we often get established what I call hierarchies of intellect. So even though non-scientists are experts in many facets of their day-to-day lives and also areas of research that we're interested in, when they're brought together with scientists, sometimes they can feel a little bit intimidated and that their voices maybe aren't worth listening to and aren't worth hearing. So if we take something, for example, like environmental change, it's really important to listen to all voices, not just scientists, because in order to solve some of the environmental change issues, we're going to need everybody to get involved. But when we bring together non-scientists and scientists, the non-scientists sometimes feel like, oh, is my voice really worth listening to? So in order to level those hierarchies of intellect, what we do, or one of the facilitatory tools that we use, is we write poetry together. And the reason that we do this is threefold. Firstly, it grants permission to the non-scientists because nobody can tell them that a poem is incorrect or correct. Secondly, it grants permission to the scientists to display an element of pathos that is often beaten out of them at an early age, really. And then thirdly, it creates a sense of shared vulnerability. As once you've heard a learned professor stand up and read a very bad haiku, you realise that actually they are fallible after all. And using poems as a starting point for dialogue is a really powerful way to give voice to those voices that might not normally be heard. And it's proven to be a really effective way of transcending cultures, transcending ages, transcending various characteristics, and is a very effective way as well of maybe finding out a little bit more in detail about how we can engender dialogues and about what some of the limitations of communication may or may not be.
You recently published a book where you focus on 6 scientist poets, or whichever way round you want to describe it. What is fascinating about the book is you don't just examine what they have done in the area of poetry and science and use poetry to communicate the science. You also look at this fascinating area of how poetry can improve the science. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So in my book, A Sonnet to Science, it looks at 6 scientists from the 1800s to the modern day, and the role and influence that poetry had in the development of their research and in their lives in general. And if we were to take one specific example from that, I think it would probably be Miroslav Holub. So Miroslav Holub was a very famous Czech immunologist and poet as well. And if we look at his poetry, it's exceptionally clinical. It's really stripped back, and it mirrors a lot of the work that he did, and certainly his approach to science. You know, as an immunologist, he did a lot of work looking at fatty cells and the roles that can potentially play in the development of cancer. And we know that in writing his poetry, it enabled him to free up a part of his mind that he wouldn't normally have been able to do, which potentially then gave him greater insight into the science that he was doing. The same with someone like Ronald Ross, who also features in the book. Ross was the scientist who first discovered the link between malaria and mosquitoes. And what was really interesting is that when he captured this link, the first thing he did was to write a poem about it. Rather than lab notes, rather than a scientific paper, the very first thing he did was to capture it in a sonnetal, which was actually a poetic form that Ross himself invented. And I think what I was trying to do with the book was, to illustrate that these people led really amazing and inspirational lives, but also that we don't need to be pigeonholed as scientists, artists, dancers, sculptors, games designers, but rather just as human beings with infinite potential. And we should be encouraged to explore multifaceted areas of research and of intrigue. And I'm always reminded of the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who has a very famous quote, which is, "The limits of my language are the limits of my world." And I just think the more that we find out about other areas of research and study, the more we can push forward the boundaries of what's possible in our own disciplines.
Can you take us also on to one of the other, talk a little bit about another of the poets in the book, Ada Lovelace, because her work has directly and hugely impacted the world today. We all rely very heavily on our computers.
Absolutely. So Ada Lovelace was a really amazing figure. She was the daughter of the infamous British poet Lord Byron, and her mother had quite a strained relationship with Lord Byron, shall we say. And as a result of this, her mother Annabel didn't want Ada to have anything to do with her father. And she was really worried that Ada would turn into a degenerate poet like her father as well. So she basically forced upon her a mathematical and scientific education, which for an early Victorian lady was pretty much unheard of. So Ada had this amazing upbringing. She was incredibly intelligent, and she was introduced to Charles Babbage, who many people see as the forefather of modern computing, who developed several things, but arguably most famously was the analytical and the difference engine, which were forefathers to the modern computers that we see now. And Ada corresponded with Babbage, suggested ideas to Babbage, but what she did most famously was Babbage never really wrote anything down, and he gave a talk once in Italy, and somebody, bizarrely actually, a former Italian Prime Minister, ended up writing it down, but in French, and then Ada Lovelace was asked to transcribe those notes of French of Babbage's speech so that there was some record of what he'd done. And when she transcribed it into English, she added a couple of notes. And, these notes, so rather than just being like, C part 1 for a slight variation on this phrase, were actually incredibly insightful addendums to the work that Babbage had done. And one of them, very famously, was where she effectively suggested a program for the machine, a series of Bernoulli numbers and beyond that. But also, which I think is more overlooked, but probably more impressive really, is that she basically made this suggestion that Babbage had designed a universal computer, so a computer that theoretically, if you changed the software, could do an infinite number of different calculations and permutations. And she made this suggestion that if you were to feed into it musical notes, then it would be able to write song, which was amazing and predated Alan Turing's own work and hypothesis around the universal computer over 100 years later. So Ada herself as well wrote beautiful poetry and wrote very eloquently that it was her own poetic sensibilities that gave her the metaphysical and meta-analytical foresight to be able to make these deductions. And in reading her poetry and in just looking at the incredible things she accomplished in a very short lifetime, it's amazing to see, as you say, what a huge impact she's had on modern technology and on computers as we use them today.
In a number of your lectures, you talk of Joy Division and Bowie. One of your poems, If Bowie Was a Scientist. I don't know whether you can recall any part of that now. Would be fantastic. I don't want to put you too much on the spot. If not, maybe you could just talk to us of the poem and how music has been so important to communicating as well and crossing the boundaries.
Of course. If Bowie was a scientist, he'd have colonised the moon and built an elevator that would have us there by noon. If Bowie were a scientist, we'd have free energy. With Tesla as his guru, we'd no longer be at sea. If Bowie were a scientist, we'd have no more... something like that. I forgot it. It's been so long since I performed it.
Sorry to put you on the spot. That was fantastic.
I don't want to do the whole thing either because he's kind of sad at the end.
I know. Yes.
But basically,
yes.
I guess a lot of my poetry looks at interdisciplinarity.
Yes.
And for me, music's a really important part of how we communicate, and it's such an important part of our lives.
Yes.
I think sometimes I get, people often say, why don't you turn your poems into song? And it's like, well, it's not to say that...
And that was going to be one of my questions, I have to admit.
Okay, well, it's a really interesting question, right? Because, I do love music. I consider myself to be relatively musical, but I think there's if we're saying, like, why do we turn poetry into song, that's saying that music is somehow, the ultimate transcendence, the ultimate evolution of poetry, whereas actually poetry and spoken word is, quite rightly, the end point of its own journey in that artistic process. And I think they're very, very different. I think, even written word versus spoken word has completely different meter, completely different subtext, completely different context and texture. And I think there's some people that do amazing work in using sound and in using soundscape to explore and to communicate. And I think that there's a lot of really interesting parallels. And I think when I've talked about music or used music in poems, it's really a way of, trying to draw out some of those parallels. So, for example, a poem that I wrote called Unnamed Pleasures, which looks at a Joy Division's very famous album. On the front of that album, there's a very famous image that adorns the walls and T-shirts of many people across the world. And what a lot of people don't know is that actually that's an image of the Pulsar CP1919, which was the first ever pulsar or pulsating star to be detected. Pulsating stars are these ancient, dead, dying stars at the edge of our universe that are rotating many millions of times and emitting high energy across the universe, which we then detect. And Dame Jocelyn Bell Burnell was the person to first detect these pulsars. And what's amazing is that, there's, as I talk about in the poem, the thing with these pulsars is that they happened billions of years ago, and yet we're still able to detect their light, their emissions, even though they're dead. And for me, there was incredible parallels with Joy Division, whose lead singer Ian Curtis tragically took his own life, and yet whose work and life and music continued to permeate through the ether and affect many of us on a day-to-day level. And I just thought that there was a tremendous overlap there between the pulsar that adorned the front of their debut album and the life of Ian Curtis himself.
I don't know whether you recall any of that.
Oh, Andrea, no. Jill, actually, no. This is actually a really, really interesting point, right?
Yeah.
So normally I do have about 10 songs 10 poems in my head.
Yes.
But I think when I first started writing poetry, it was very much to perform, and very much as spoken word. And this was very much a one-way method of communication,
yes.
which I love doing. I like performing. I like standing up on stage and reading about reading poems, and that was great. But I realised that actually I was maybe denying myself the opportunity to write poetry in a slightly different way. So write poetry that could be appreciated and understood and read without my voice and without the need for me to be there. And as I went on that journey and went through that development phase, which is, I guess, where I see myself now, I still love to perform poetry, obviously. What that really demonstrated to me was that poetry, rather than just being this one-way method of communication, could actually be a facilitatory tool through which to engender dialogue, which is where the vast majority of my current research sits, and which is what I find so enticing about the use of poetry in science communication, because you can have this one-way method of communication through spoken word, through the reading of poetry, but you can also have this incredible two-way dialogue in which we're not really worried about the aesthetics of the poem, but it's just a medium, a conduit, if you will, through which to give voice to a variety of different people.
You lecture in a university. The recent activism by Greta Thunberg, she's a school child. Would you, or do you, go into schools? Because one could argue that we should be trying to encourage kids from a very young age so that they don't lose that sense of curiosity. They keep it and then take it with them through life. Do you work with schools and school children?
Absolutely. So I
great.
see several thousand school children a year, probably. I do a lot less now with schools than I used to. But a lot of my work with schools is exactly this. It's in trying to break down the interdisciplinary barriers that tell children that they have to choose between certain career paths at an age of 7. So I know very much myself, when I was at secondary school, I was always fortunate enough to do well in the sciences and the maths. So I was very much encouraged to do science and to do maths at A level, and not really encouraged so much to do the artistic side of things. But then when I was at university, I did a lot of acting and playwriting and was able to continue to pursue that. And what I think is really important is in working with school children and encouraging that curiosity and encouraging them to ask questions as well. And certainly when you're working with very young school children, so in the UK with primary school children, teachers are absolutely amazing, and they do a job that I just would not be able to do. But what we find sometimes is that with primary school teachers, a lot of them, unless their specialism was in science, haven't maybe done science since they themselves were, 16 or 17 years old. So sometimes they can, quite rightly feel a little underconfident with it. And when school children ask them a question, it's very difficult because there's that power dynamic between teacher and children, and they're unable to answer it. So sometimes they might suppress that question. Whereas what I do and what I have done is go into these schools, and if a child asks me a question, and I'm a doctor with several letters after my name, and I don't know the answer, which happens all the time, I'm just like, I don't know. But let's find out together, and let's see how we can, answer that curiosity. And in doing that, it demonstrates to the teacher that actually it's all right not to have all of the answers, and that what we should be doing is encouraging the children and encouraging young people to keep asking questions and to keep having that curiosity. And I know that myself, like, the reason why I'm curious is that no one ever really told me, well, maybe sometimes when they'd had enough of it, no one really ever told me to stop asking questions. And I think that's such a powerful thing. And that's what science is, really. It's about asking questions, and also realising that science isn't the only medium through which to ask and answer questions. So a really nice activity that we do is we go into schools and we do a series of experiments with them, quite like visual experiments where we add a load of stuff together and makes like fumes not noxious and like loads of colours and foam. It looks really nice, and we talk about the science. But then what we ask them to do is we ask them to write up the experience as a poem, demonstrating to them that there's not a mutual exclusivity between science and poetry, but rather they're just complementary ways of trying to understand the world and the way in which we live.
As well as being a senior science communicator, poet, you're also a climate change scientist. How do you see things panning out? We've now entered a period of election campaigning. An article was published by BBC News yesterday, which asked the question, will climate change be one of the issues on which people vote? Do you think it will be? That's part one of the question. Part two of the question is, what do you think the tipping point will be for people, the sort of general public, to act? We obviously are seeing more demonstrations across the world. We spoke about Greta earlier, but Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called Tipping Point. What do you think the tipping point will be, or when will it be?
Okay, so to answer your first question, I think that we already know that climate change and the climate catastrophe is really important to voters in the UK. There was a survey done the other day that said that over 65% of people see it as a priority. Now, with the current political situation, it looks as though the general election is going to be, unfortunately, a one agenda election. We all know what that agenda will be, so I don't need to say it, which is a real shame, as I think that there's real momentum. And of course, the thing about climate change is that it's apolitical. It doesn't differentiate between Conservatives, Greens, Liberals, Labour, Brexit Party. It affects all of us, right? And thankfully in the UK, it's maybe slightly less than it is in the US in terms of I wear this badge of climate change acknowledger, climate change denier versus based on my political leanings. But it's something that affects all of us, and it's something that is apolitical. And actually, I think that climate change bizarrely offers us, I am an optimist, but I think it offers us an opportunity to actually transcend many barriers, to forget about the incredibly tiny differences that we have between us when we actually consider the overwhelming similarities we have as human beings, and to put aside those differences and to work together. And I think we've already reached the tipping point. I think that there's a need for all voices to be heard, not just as a box-ticking exercise, but because through true diversity comes true innovation. I think it's encouraging that we're in the UK being invited to take part in these citizens' assemblies. But I think there is an urgency that at times is missing. I also think what's really, really important is that people do not feel as though they should take absolute individual blame for the current state of the environment. Because even though all of us could be doing more to either reduce or offset our carbon footprints, I think that the actual blame lies with national government because of their inaction. And there's a real danger that by passing off that blame to individuals, that can become so stigmatizing, so affecting, that we're actually paralyzed into inaction. So yes, we need to act. Yes, there's an urgency, but people need to not have individual guilt associated with it, and instead need to think about positive actions that they can take, positive steps they can do. And something that everybody can do and everybody should be doing is to write to their MP and tell them that climate change is an issue that is vital to them, is important to them, and is not going away.
Who are your strongest influences now in terms of individuals in your life?
I'm incredibly fortunate to work in an environment where I'm surrounded by extremely intelligent, influential and generous people on a day-to-day basis, and I have many sources of inspiration in my personal and professional life. If I'm to think of someone who's really strongly influenced my work and my practice in the past half decade or so, it would be my friend and colleague, the British poet Dan Simpson. So Dan and myself have done a lot of collaborative work together in bringing together scientists and poets to create explorations of the liminal spaces between science and poetry. And Dan, as well as being a good friend and an incredibly talented poet, is also very generous. And really, working with him, I gradually began to understand that actually it's not just scientists who have research pedigree, and it's not just poets who have a element of creativity, but rather it's all of us. And that if we want to conduct effective interdisciplinary research and interdisciplinary explorations, then that interdisciplinary meeting of minds needs to happen at the very beginning of the project rather than at the end. And that's a huge influence that Dan's had on me. And really my whole research ethos has changed as a result of that, for which I'm incredibly grateful.
Aside from Dan, maybe during your younger years when you were finding out about what you wanted to do, did you make rich connections with people who changed the course of your life? Were there any individuals that maybe helped you personally, not professionally, or a combination of the two that helped propel you forward?
After I finished my PhD, I was really fortunate to get a scholarship from the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation to go and live and work in Japan for 2 years. And it was an amazing opportunity that basically afforded me the time and space and finance to do whatever I wanted, as long as it had a link between Japan. And I was really fascinated at this point in my life in the links between science and theatre, and how theatre could potentially be used as a way to effectively communicate science. And whilst I was there, I did a work placement at Saitama Theatre under the tutelage of a Japanese director called Yukio Ninagawa. And Yukio Ninagawa-san, or Yukio Ninagawa-sensei rather, is sadly no longer with us. He passed away a couple of years ago, but he was one of, if not the leading light in modern Japanese theatre. And I always remember he was this incredibly talented, incredibly driven man. And yeah, when I went to Saitama Theatre, I was very young. He he'd let me watch all the rehearsals, he'd let me talk to him about his methods. And on the last day there, he let me come and sit next to him in the assistant director's chair. And he gave me an incredible gift. He gave me a collection of one of his works, which is obviously very nice. But then he wrote a note in front to me in Japanese. And he'd given me a name. And so in how Japanese works, with hiragana, katakana, and kanji, there's various symbols that can be used to represent phonetic sounds. So my name in Japanese would be Samu, but you could use a variety of different kanjis, of the 80,000, to make Samu, and the different combinations mean different things. And obviously giving someone a name is a pretty huge honour in any culture. But he'd picked these two letters. Bear in mind that Yuki Ninigawa's work was largely around Japanese translations of Shakespeare, and he'd created this name which the two characters literally translate as Shakespeare's dream, which is read as Samu, which was amazing. And
yes,
it's
lovely.
one of the most generous gifts I think I've ever been given.
Out of everybody that you could meet in the world that you haven't met so far, of course you've described some incredible people that you've come into contact with. Who would you most like to meet, and what question would you like to ask that person?
This is such a difficult question to ask, because there's so many people who inspire me on a daily basis. I think if I was to think genuinely about this, someone who's a huge inspiration to me is such an obvious answer, but is Barack Obama. Just because I think he has such humility and grace in the way that he goes about speaking about things, and also his skill as an orator is phenomenal. And I think the question that I'd like to ask him is, how do you project such humility when you yourself are under such personal attack? And I think that would be a really valuable lesson to learn from him.
How do people buy your book? How do people get hold of you? What's the name of your website?
So my website is www.samillingworth.com. That's samillingworth.com. And from my website, you can access my blog, The Poetry of Science, where each week I read a new piece of scientific research and communicate its findings via poetry. You can also find a link to my podcast, also called The Poetry of Science, which goes into a slightly deeper dive of the poetry and science in question. And you can purchase my book, A Sonnet to Science, via all leading retailers, online and in person. And also you can find details of it on my website. And if people would like to get in contact with me, I'm an avid tweeter, and my Twitter handle is @SamIllingworth.
One final question before you go. Ada Lovelace wanted a poem called The Rainbow on her grave. Her wishes weren't honoured, but it was later put on a monument. What poem would you like on your grave?
What poem would I like on my grave? Okay, there's a poem that I do remember that I love, and it's written by Rebecca Elson, who's the sixth poet that features in my book. And she was an incredible poet and an astronomer, and I think she did an amazing job in this poem of capturing what it meant to be a scientist. We astronomers are nomads, merchants, circus people, all the earth our tent. We are industrious, we breed enthusiasms, honour our responsibility to all. But the universe has moved a long way off. Sometimes starlight seems too sharp, and like the moon I move my face to the floor, to the small patch where each foot falls. Before it falls, and I forget to ask questions and only count things.
Dr. Sam Illingworth, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much, Andrea.